Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. Genoa City has witnessed backstabbings, power heists, and rumored secrets for decades, but nothing could have prepared its citizens for the unbelievable moment that unfolded in broad daylight when Jack Abbott, the man so frequently defined by control and confidence, eventually shattered in front of everyone and changed the Newman, Abbott heritage ever. Because it all began with a clinch that wasn't supposed to mean anything further than fraternal support, yet incontinently felt like fortune snapping into place as Jack crossed the room, eyes glassy and hands shaking, and pulled Nick Newman into his arms with a raw despair that stunned bystanders into silence. This wasn't a polite grasp or a calculated move, this was Jack adhering to Nick as if holding on to the last piece of his soul, gashes streaming freely down his face as he rumored words no bone could relatively hear. And Nick, confused, emotional, visibly shaken, said at first before artificially hugging back, ignorant that this single act of vulnerability was about to crack open one of Genoa City's most precisely buried secrets, because the moment Jack broke down, Nikki Newman's world collapsed, her countenance fracturing as she watched the two men locked together, commodity ancient and inarguable flashing in her eyes, a verity she had guarded for decades suddenly clawing its way to the face, demanding to be heard. Substantiations noticed Nikki pale, her hand clinging her casket as if her heart itself were revolting against the falsehood she had lived with for so long, and when Jack eventually pulled down, his face destroyed by emotion, his voice coarse as he tried to explain that he didn't indeed know why he'd done it, that commodity inside him had simply snapped, Nikki realized the macrocosm had left her no further caching places, because fate, cruel and grim, had decided the verity would come out now. In the most public, ruinous way possible. As murmurs gurgled through the room and Victor Newman narrowed his eyes with growing dubitation, Nikki took a pulsing step forward, her voice cracking as she demanded everyone hear, and in that moment, time itself sounded to break. Genoa City leaned in, seeing history being rewritten, and Nikki, queen of secrets, survivor of 1,000 dishonors, eventually spoke the words that would crump families and rewrite pedigrees ever. Revealing that Jack Abbott wasn't just Nick's rival, not just Victor's adversary, but Nick Newman's natural father, the real father, the verity hidden beneath times of falsehoods, manipulation, and fear, a concession that landed like an earthquake, leaving stupefied silence in its wake before chaos erupted, because Nick's face drained of color as the world listed beneath his bases, his entire identity suddenly over for debate, recollections rushing back with brutal clarity. Moments when he'd felt different, moments when he'd disaccorded with Victor, moments when Jack had inexplicably shown up for him, and Jack, hearing the words spoken audibly for the first time, collapsed into a president, blubbing penly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had been stolen from him and from Nick, decades lost to secretiveness, motherhood denied, love suppressed for the sake of survival. Nikki's concession revealed out in fractions, each further ruinous than the last, as she admitted the affair, the fear, the pressure from Victor, the insolvable choice she'd made to cover her child while destroying two men in the process, explaining that Jack had no way known, that she'd buried the verity so deeply she'd nearly induced herself it wasn't real, yet then it was, inarguable, gaping them all in the face, and as she spoke, Jack rose again, crossing the room sluggishly, until he stood in front of Nick, voice shaking as he apologized for every absence he no way knew he'd committed, for every birthday he missed, every moment Victor claimed as his own, and Nick, overwhelmed, angry, fractured, lashed out at first, demanding to know how this could be real, how his entire life could be erected on a taradiddle, but also commodity broke in him too, because beneath the rage was grief, and beneath the grief was a craving he'd no way allowed himself to name. And when Jack reached for him again, this time Nick didn't vacillate, gripping Jack tightly as gashes eventually revealed, the two men adhering to each other as father and son at last, the room buzzing with unbelief as Genoa City watched a dynasty collapse and another rise from its ashes. Victor, furious and lowered, roared and kicked, criminating Nikki of treason beyond remission and Jack of manipulation, but his words chimed concave against the raw verity unfolding before him, because for the first time, Victor Newman wasn't the most important man in the room, just a hubby brazened with a history he couldn't control, and Nikki, eyes brimming with remorse, stood her ground, declaring that the taradiddle had formerly bring her everything and she'd no longer let it bring Nick his verity, while whispers spread like campfire through the megacity, alliances shifting in real time as everyone realized what this meant. Nick Newman, long presumed Victor's heir at law, now carried Abbott blood, incontinently redrawing the lines of commercial warfare and particular fidelity, kindling questions about Newman Enterprises, Abbott heritage, and who truly belonged where. As the shockwaves gurgled outward, Jack set up himself torn between joy and desolation, enraptured to eventually claim his son yet agonized over the time stolen from them, confessing to Nick that the clinch had been instinct, commodity ancient fating its own, a pull he'd no way been suitable to explain until now, and Nick, voice raw, admitted he'd always felt that pull too, a strange sense of familiarity with Jack that now made intimidating sense, while Nikki watched them with dashes streaming, knowing she'd opened a door that could no way be closed, one that would hang her marriage, fracture her family, and review her place in Genoa City ever. By evening, the story had exploded across the megacity, phones buzzing, secrets unraveling, adversaries recalculating their coming moves, because this wasn't just a family disclosure, it was a seismic shift in power, identity, and heritage, with Jack Abbott stepping into a part he no way anticipated, Nick Newman facing an unborn rewritten by blood, and Nikki Newman ever marked as the woman whose verity changed everything, leaving Genoa City stunned, shaken, and empty for what comes next, because if one clinch could unleash a secret this big, no bone was safe from what the verity might destroy, or produce, next. The fallout did end with the disclosure it only boosted, spreading through Genoa City like a slow-burning campfire that refused to be contained, because once the verity was spoken audibly, it demanded consequences, and those consequences began the moment Nick eventually pulled down from Jack, his hands still gripping the fabric of Jack's jacket as if letting go meant losing him each over again, his voice slightly steady as he asked the question that cut deeper than any blameworthiness. "Why didn't you tell me?" A question aimed at Nikki but heavy enough to crush everyone in the room, because there was no answer that could ever justify decades of silence, only explanations concentrated with fear, remorse, and survival, and Nikki, shaking uncontrollably, admitted she'd been scarified of Victor, scarified of losing her son, alarmed that the verity would destroy them all, no way imagining that the taradiddle itself would come the real lemon, one that had just gone off in the most ruinous way possible. Jack heeded to every word with gripped fists and shattered countenance, realizing that while Nikki had carried the secret alone, he'd intentionally lived a life missing a piece of himself, and when he eventually spoke again, his voice broke as he confessed that all those times of contest with Victor, all that bitterness and competition, now felt poisoned by a verity he no way knew he was fighting against, because Victor hadn't just been his rival, he'd been the man raising Jack's son. Shaping him, impacting his choices, loving him fiercely in his own way, and that consummation tore Jack piecemeal with an admixture of rage and guilt so violent it nearly stole his breath. Nick, meanwhile, was twisting internally, his identity splintering as recollections replayed through a new lens every fight with Victor, every moment he'd mutinied, every time he'd felt like he didn't relatively fit the earth of Victor Newman's perfect heir at law, now screaming with new meaning, and as he stepped down from both parents, demanding space, Genoa City felt the pressure shift, because Nick Newman, strong, pious, predicated Nick was suddenly unmoored, a man forced to question not just who his father was, but who he himself had been each on, and when he eventually spoke again, his words stunned everyone into silence as he admitted he didn't know where he belonged presently, that he felt like a foreigner in his own life, caught between two families who had been at war for decades. Victor refused to let the moment belong to anyone differently, his fury erupting as he indicted Nikki of demotion and Jack of theft, declaring that blood didn't abolish the times he'd spent raising Nick, putrefying him, standing by him, and for the first time, Nick turned on Victor with an icy calm that cut deeper than wrathfulness, telling him that love erected on a taradiddle was still a taradiddle, and while Victor might always be part of his life, the verity had changed commodity. Abecedarian between them, a boundary that could no way completely be undone, leaving Victor visibly shaken, his power slipping not in business, but in the most ruinous arena of all, his family. As the crowd dispersed and whispers echoed through the halls, Jack and Nick set up themselves alone at last, the weight of history pressing down between them, and Jack, wiping his eyes, offered Nick commodity he'd no way dared to before: tolerance, space, and unconditional presence, promising he wouldn't demand a relationship, wouldn't push, wouldn't try to replace anyone, only asking for the chance to know him, to be there now. Still Nick demanded, and that modesty, so unlike the Jack Abbott Genoa City had known, hit Nick harder than any dramatic gesture, because for the first time, motherhood wasn't being asserted or controlled, it was being offered, still, hypercritically, and Nick jounced, gashes welling as he admitted he didn't know how to do this either, but he didn't want to walk down from it. Nikki's reckoning came fleetly and mercilessly, as Victor brazened her behind unrestricted doors, his wrathfulness giving way to desolation, criminating her of destroying their marriage, their heritage, and their family with one concession, and Nikki, exhausted and raw, eventually stood up to him in a way she no way had ahead, declaring that the marriage had survived numerous storms erected on power and manipulation, but it couldn't survive another day erected on falsehoods, and that she refused to apologize for eventually choosing verity over fear, indeed if it bring her everything, leaving Victor stunned by her resoluteness, realizing too late that control had eventually slipped through his fritters. Across city, the counter-accusations began to ripple outward, with whispers of commercial bouleversement and legal challenges swirling as questions arose about Nick's place at Newman Enterprises, Abbott influence, and whether blood would now pull Nick toward Jabot rather, fueling enterprise, alliances, and fear, because if Nick chose to embrace his Abbott lineage, it could enkindle a commercial war unlike anything Genoa City had ever seen, and Jack, completely apprehensive of the stakes, made it clear, intimately, that Nick's value to him had nothing to do with power or business, a protestation that stunned indeed his own abettors and made his vulnerability insolvable to dismiss as strategy. As night fell, Nick stood alone on the Newman sundeck, gaping out at the megacity he allowed he knew, while Jack approached still, not wanting to intrude, and in that quiet moment, stripped of substantiations and shock, Nick eventually let himself suffer, not just the taradiddle, but the life that could have been, the knowledge with Jack he no way had, the choices he might have made else, and when Jack placed a conditional hand on his shoulder, Nick didn't pull down, allowing the silence to speak volumes, two men bound by blood and loss, standing at the edge of an unknown future. By the time Genoa City went to sleep, nothing was the same. Nikki's verity had shattered a dynasty, Victor's control had cracked, Jack Abbott had set up his son, and Nick Newman stood at the crossroads of identity and heritage, knowing that whatever choice he made coming, Abbott, Newman, or commodity entirely his own, would review the megacity ever, because this wasn't just a secret revealed, it was the birth of a new chapter written in gashes, verity, and an unbreakable bond that had eventually, incredibly, set up its way into the light. The coming morning actualized over Genoa City within creepy stillness, the kind that follows a seismic event when the ground looks the same but everyone knows it isn't, and that quiet only magnified the desolation Nikki's concession had unleashed, because by daylight the disclosure that Jack Abbott was Nick Newman's natural father had formerly spread to every corner of the megacity, rumored over coffee at Crimson Lights, batted in hushed tones at Newman Enterprises, and deconstructed relentlessly behind unrestricted doors at Jabot, where Jack stood alone in his office gaping out the window, replaying the moment his arms had wrapped around Nick and his world had cracked wide open, realizing that the clinch hadn't just exposed a secret, it had awakened a continuance of stolen moments that could no way be recovered, and yet, beneath the grief, there was a fragile, intimidating stopgap that refused to be silenced, because for the first time in his life, Jack Abbott knew he was a father, and nothing, not Victor's rage, not commercial fallout, not public reproach, could abolish that verity. Nick, meanwhile, woke up feeling like a foreigner in his own skin, every memory now rewritten by blood, as he wandered through the Newman house touching familiar objects that suddenly felt espoused, the walls heavy with a history he no longer knew how to claim, and when he ran into Victoria, her shock slightly concealed beneath fierce concern, the siblings locked eyes in a moment of raw understanding, because while Victoria was still Victor's unquestioned son, Nick now enthralled a liminal space, neither completely Newman nor completely Abbott, and when she asked him how he was holding up, he surprised himself by admitting he felt concave, like commodity essential had been removed and replaced all at formerly, a concession that left Victoria speechless, realizing this wasn't just a reproach, it was an empirical earthquake tearing her family piecemeal. Victor, on the other hand, had gone straight into battle mode, summoning attorneys, strategists, and confidants as if this were a hostile preemption rather than a family implosion, refusing to accept that blood could overweigh decades of motherhood, declaring that no DNA test could abolish the bond he'd forged with Nick, yet indeed as he barked orders and demanded fidelity, cracks showed in his armor. Because for the first time, Victor Newman wasn't fighting an adversary, he was fighting the Verity, and Verity had a way of slipping through indeed the tightest grip, especially when Nick eventually brazened him intimately, demanding honesty rather of dominance, telling Victor he demanded space, not control, and watching the great Victor Newman falter under those words was a moment that shook the foundations of power in Genoa City. At Jabot, whispers turned into enterprise into pressure, as board members and directors eyed Jack with renewed interest, some seeing occasion, others seeing chaos, and when someone dared to ask whether Nick might have a future at the company now that his Abbott lineage was verified, Jack shut it down incontinently, his voice establishment and uncharacteristically gentle as he declared that Nick's identity wasn't a log-rolling chip, a station that stunned everyone, because this wasn't the Jack Abbott they were used to, the man who thrived on strategy and influence, but a man stripped down to commodity far more dangerous, authenticity, and that authenticity only strengthened when Jack sought Nikki out again, not to charge or rage, but to understand, to defy the time stolen from both of them, and Nikki, broken yet bent, admitted that the taradiddle had visited her every day, that she'd watched Jack and Nick circle each other for times, no way daring to let the Verity face, scarified of Victor's wrath and the destruction it would beget, no way realizing that the destruction would come anyway, just delayed and magnified. As the days passed, Nick set up himself drawn to Jack despite his confusion, small moments erecting conditional islands, an unanticipated phone call, a participated memory redefined, a quiet lunch where words were meager but meaning heavy, and each commerce minced down at the wall Nick had erected around his heart, because Jack wasn't trying to claim him or rewrite his history, only to show up, constantly and without demand, a presence Nick hadn't known he'd been missing, and when Jack eventually told Nick he was proud of the man he'd come, anyhow of who raised him, the words landed with unanticipated force, unleashing commodity deep and paining inside Nick, commodity that had always sustained for that specific kind of blessing. Nikki's world, still, continued to unravel as Victor oscillated between fury and wounded silence, their marriage strained to its breaking point, because the Verity had shifted the power dynamic irrevocably, and Nikki, formerly defined by her amenability to endure Victor's control, now refused to retreat, averring that honesty was no longer negotiable. Indeed, when Victor indicted her of destroying their heritage, she shot back that the heritage had been poisoned long before she spoke the Verity, a battle that echoed through the house and left both of them standing on contrary sides of an ocean neither knew how to cross.